I had been living in my house for exactly 19 days when a woman I had never met knocked on my door with the authority of someone who thought she owned the place. She had a stack of papers in one hand, a clipboard in the other, and the kind of tight-lipped smile you see on people just before they ruin your week. Without waiting for me to invite her in, she announced she was president of the HOA, as though I had been waiting all my life for this moment. Then she told me I owed $1,850 in back HOA fees. I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was such a profoundly stupid thing to say to someone whose property wasn't even in an HOA. Her name was Karen, yes, really, and she informed me my street was about to be annexed into the Willow Ridge Homeowners Association. Apparently, her vision of community order involved including unwilling participants through what she called preemptive compliance, a phrase that made me think of military coups. When I pointed out I had never signed any agreement, she pulled out a printed map with a red marker line drawn around my house and said, "We've decided you're in." I asked if she thought that was legally binding. She said, "Oh, absolutely." I could have closed the door right there, but I was curious. People like Karen operate on a mix of self-confidence and bluffing, and I wanted to see how far she'd take it. So I invited her in under the pretense of getting my checkbook. She stepped inside like she was inspecting her newest acquisition, eyes darting to the trim on the windows and the state of my kitchen counters. She handed me a welcome packet filled with bylaws, a glossy pamphlet showing pictures of other people's houses, and a printout of community rules that banned everything from basketball hoops to garage sales. Karen's pitch was rehearsed: how the HOA protected property values and maintained standards. I asked her how she explained the brown patches of grass and broken shutters I'd seen in my so-called community. She ignored that and moved on to fines. Apparently, should I refuse to join, I could be fined for things like inconsistent mailbox design or parking violations if I had so much as a guest car in the driveway overnight. She even had a list of potential compliance issues she'd noted during her walk up to my door. That was when I decided she needed to be taught a lesson. Not the petty kind, but the kind that ended with her wondering how she had lost the war before she even realized she was in one. I smiled, told her I'd think about it, and let her leave with the confidence of someone who thought she had just bagged her latest victim. The next day, a bright yellow violation notice was taped to my mailbox, citing me for unsanctioned exterior paint color and non-regulation landscaping. My house had been freshly painted last month in a neutral color, and my lawn was immaculate, but this wasn't about rules. This was about showing me she could. It was a power play, and it was about to backfire spectacularly. I spent that evening digging into the Willow Ridge HOA's corporate filings. It turned out the HOA was a non-profit corporation, complete with a board of directors, annual filings with the state, and, this was my favorite part, a charter that made membership voluntary unless a legal covenant existed on the deed. My deed had no such covenant. More interestingly, the HOA was barely scraping by financially. Their annual budget was laughably small, they were operating at a deficit, and their own bylaws stated that dissolution could occur if 2/3 of the members voted for it. That was the seed of my plan. But I wasn't going to rush. First, I needed to become a member. Not because I wanted to, but because membership was the only way to get inside their voting structure. So I paid the ridiculous back dues in cash, smiled when Karen smugly welcomed me aboard, and attended my first meeting in their beige-carpeted community center. She ran the meeting like a dictator with a bad Wi-Fi connection, constantly cutting people off, speaking over anyone who disagreed, and making motions that passed without real vote. She clearly wasn't used to anyone challenging her. At the meeting, I kept my mouth shut except to ask questions that made her explain complicated bylaws she didn't fully understand. I could see the other members shifting uncomfortably as they realized she was winging it. Afterward, 2 residents approached me in the parking lot to vent. One complained about the absurd fines. The other said they'd tried to run for the board but had been procedurally disqualified by Karen. These were exactly the kind of people I needed. Over the next few weeks, I attended every meeting, smiled through every absurd motion, and quietly built alliances. I hosted casual backyard barbecues for neighbors, always making sure there was plenty of beer and subtle conversation about how much better life would be without an HOA breathing down our neck. I learned which members were furious about rising dues, who hated the landscaping restrictions, and who felt bullied by Karen. My list grew. Then Karen overplayed her hand. She fined an elderly widow on the next street for having holiday decorations up in mid-January. The decorations were a single wreath on her door. When the widow cried during the meeting, Karen shrugged and said rules were rules. That was the moment the room turned on her. People began openly questioning her decisions, something I had never seen happen before. I knew it was time to make my move. I pulled a printed copy of the dissolution clause from my folder and read it aloud to the room. Karen tried to shut me down, saying dissolution was impossible, but I explained in plain language. If 2/3 of the membership voted for it, the HOA would cease to exist. No more dues. No more fines. Everyone would keep their property value without the constant harassment. I could feel the tide shift. Karen's eyes narrowed. She realized I wasn't just another resident to push around. I was someone who had read the rulebook, memorized it, and was about to use it against her. And for the first time since I'd met her, she didn't look entirely confident. She looked worried. What she didn't know was that I had already collected signed statements from over half the members in support of a dissolution vote. By the time I called for it, she would be scrambling to save her little empire, and there would be nothing she could do. Because the game had already been decided. She just hadn't figured it out yet. Karen came back at me faster than I expected. 3 days after I'd planted the seed about dissolving the HOA, a certified letter arrived at my door. The return address was Willow Ridge Homeowners Association, but the tone was pure Karen, every word practically dripping with threat. According to the letter, my recent conduct at the last meeting had been disruptive and potentially in violation of community civility standards. It warned that further obstruction could result in sanctions, including suspension of my voting privileges. I read it twice, then set it on the counter and laughed. If she was resorting to paper threats, it meant she was rattled. And if she thought I'd fold under pressure, she hadn't been paying attention. I wasn't about to respond directly. Karen thrived on public spats because they gave her a platform to look in control. So instead, I doubled down on being the polite, cooperative member. I attended the next meeting, sat near the front, and even nodded along to some of her announcements as though we were on the same side. When she tried to ignore me during open discussion, I didn't argue. I simply passed my printed proposal for a formal dissolution vote to every single person in the room. Watching her eyes follow the pages as they traveled from hand to hand was deeply satisfying. I had already done my homework. The HOA had exactly 41 official members, meaning I needed 28 votes to win. I had 22 in my pocket from prior conversations. Some were lukewarm supporters who just wanted lower dues, others were angry veterans of Karen's petty fines. But to secure the last few votes, I needed to go beyond complaints and give people something they could feel in their gut, a vision of life after the HOA. So I started inviting neighbors over for coffee one by one. We'd sit in my kitchen while I laid out the numbers. Without the HOA's bloated budget for administrative costs, read Karen's endless flyers and unnecessary landscaping contracts, each homeowner could save over $1,200 a year. We could still maintain our own yards, still hire services as needed, and keep our neighborhood exactly as it was, minus the surveillance and the power trip. By the end of each conversation, I'd slide a dissolution petition across the table and let them sign if they wanted. Only one person flat out refused. The rest either signed on the spot or called me back within a week. Karen must have sensed the shift in the wind, because she suddenly became nice. I ran into her while walking my dog, and she made a point of complimenting my lawn. 2 days later, she left a "welcome to the neighborhood" basket on my porch, full of fruit and a scented candle that smelled like it was trying to cover up a gas leak. I almost admired her attempt. It was the classic charm offensive, a last-ditch effort to win back control, but the timing was too perfect to be coincidence. She was nervous. Her mask slipped at the following meeting. As soon as I raised my hand to request a motion for a dissolution vote, she launched into a 10-minute monologue about the chaos that would follow without the HOA. According to her, lawns would die, mailboxes would rust, and roving bands of undesirable renters would flood the neighborhood. She claimed property values would plummet overnight. The fearmongering was almost impressive in its creativity. When she finally paused for breath, I simply held up the HOA's own financial reports and asked her to point to a single expenditure that directly raised property values. She couldn't. By now, the room was divided. Half were loyalists who believed her horror stories. The other half were tired of being nickel-and-dimed. But the real battle wasn't happening in those meetings. It was happening in living rooms, backyards, and group text. My allies had been talking to their friends and family members who lived in Willow Ridge, sharing their own stories of fines, overreach, and intimidation. The narrative was shifting from "the HOA protects us" to "the HOA is the problem." Karen's next move was a masterclass in desperation. She called an emergency town hall for all residents, promising to reveal new community improvements. When we arrived, the improvements turned out to be a proposal for installing security cameras at the entrances, paid for by doubling annual dues. She framed it as a necessary safety measure, citing a vague increase in suspicious activity, without providing any actual police report. Several members clapped, but I noticed the hesitation in their faces. Doubling dues was a hard sell, especially for people already annoyed at her spending. During the Q&A, I asked if these new cameras would be voted on by the membership. She said the board had executive authority to approve urgent measures without a vote. That was her biggest mistake yet. People hate having money taken without their consent. The murmurs of discontent around the room told me she had just handed me another weapon. The following morning, I printed a flyer comparing the HOA's spending to actual neighborhood need. In bold letters at the top, "Where does your money go?" Underneath, a simple pie chart: 37% administrative costs, 24% miscellaneous, 15% legal fees, 14% landscaping, 10% community events. Not a single dollar for security, road maintenance, or anything that could legitimately be called infrastructure. I didn't need to editorialize. The numbers spoke for themselves. By the end of the week, I had 4 more signatures. I was at 26, too shy of my target. Those last 2 votes came from the unlikeliest place. There was a couple on the far side of the neighborhood, Paul and Marissa, who were known to be fiercely pro-HOA. They kept their house in pristine condition, reported code violations, and even hosted HOA holiday event. I had written them off months ago. But then Karen fined them for having a delivery truck parked in their driveway for more than 4 hours during a furniture delivery. It was the perfect example of her turning on her own. By the time I visited, they were furious and ready to hear me out. Paul signed immediately. Marissa hesitated but followed his lead. That made 28. I didn't call the vote immediately. I wanted to time it for maximum impact. So I waited until the next regular meeting, when attendance was highest. I arrived early, sat in my usual spot, and watched Karen work the room. She was trying to project confidence, but her laugh was a little too loud, her smile a little too fixed. When the meeting reached new business, I stood up and formally requested a vote on dissolution under Article 14, Section 3 of the bylaws. She tried to interrupt, but this time, half the room told her to let me speak. I laid out the case clearly, calmly, and without personal attacks. The HOA was overreaching, financially inefficient, and no longer serving the majority's interests. I reminded them that dissolution wouldn't change our ability to maintain our own properties or organize voluntary events. Then I handed out the ballots I'd prepared, each one marked with a simple yes or no checkbox. Karen's voice rose an octave as she warned of total collapse and anarchy. But when the votes were collected and counted by the secretary, someone who clearly wasn't on her side, the numbers were undeniable: 28 in favor, 13 against. Exactly the 2/3 required. I didn't have to wait long to find out who the man in the suit was. 2 days after the dissolution vote, I got a letter, hand-delivered this time, on thick, cream-colored stationery that screamed expensive law firm. It was from the office of Taylor and Beckett, and it alleged that the dissolution vote was invalid due to deficiencies in notice, procedural irregularities, and violations of fiduciary duty. Translation: Karen had lawyered up. The letter demanded that the HOA's operations be restored immediately and warned that further unilateral actions would result in litigation. I read it over coffee, my dog snoring at my feet, and smiled. If Karen wanted to play in the legal arena, she had picked the wrong opponent. What she didn't know, and what I wasn't about to tell her, was that I'd spent the last decade running a small but successful consulting firm that specialized in corporate compliance and governance. My clients were nonprofits, HOAs, and the occasional neighborhood association. I'd helped dozens of them navigate their own bylaws, state statutes, and dissolution processes. I wasn't just some homeowner with a grudge. I was someone who knew exactly how these things worked and, more importantly, how to make sure they were airtight. Still, this was a new twist. The lawyer's tone was aggressive, which told me they were trying to intimidate rather than win on the merits. That meant their case was weak. But I also knew that if Karen was willing to bring in legal firepower, she wouldn't stop at letters. She'd push for injunctions, drag things into court, and burn through her supporters' goodwill in the process. The trick was to make her burn through that goodwill faster than she could rebuild it. Step 1 was transparency. I scanned the lawyer's letter and emailed it to every single HOA member, past and present, along with a brief, plain-language breakdown of what it meant and why it was baseless. I pointed out that the bylaws required no special notice beyond what we'd already given, that the vote was counted in accordance with their own rules, and that dissolution was now a matter of record with the state. I ended the email with a simple question: do you want your dues funding this legal fight? The responses started pouring in within the hour, ranging from absolutely not to how can we make this stop? Step 2 was cutting off Karen's funding. Technically, the HOA still had a small bank account, even after the dissolution vote, but it could only be accessed by board members. And since the dissolution process meant the board was now legally required to wind down operations, any spending that wasn't for legitimate winding down could be challenged as misappropriation. I filed a formal notice with the state's corporate division stating that I'd be acting as a member representative to oversee compliance. That put a freeze on large withdrawals until the matter was resolved. Karen must have realized her financial leash had been shortened, because she started working the neighborhood harder than ever. She hosted an informal community meeting at her house, complete with wine, cheese, and glossy handouts about the dangers of leaderless neighborhoods. She even dug up a few fear-mongering articles about declining property values in HOA-free communities. Never mind that they were from states 3 time zones away and involved completely different circumstances. One of my allies, a guy named Chris, went to the meeting just to see what she was up to. He texted me afterward. "She's saying you are the reason the HOA is in chaos. Claims you have a personal vendetta." That was actually useful. If Karen wanted to make it personal, I could use that against her, because personal attacks made her look petty, while my strategy was about keeping it businesslike, calm, and focused on the facts. The next morning, I drafted another neighborhood-wide email, this one titled, "Let's Set the Record Straight." I calmly addressed each of her claims, using the HOA's own financial reports and bylaws as evidence. No snark, no insults, just undeniable facts laid out in a way that made it impossible for a reasonable person to side with her. Then I closed with an offer. If anyone had concerns about the dissolution process, I'd be happy to walk them through it in person, one-on-one. I booked coffee dates for the next 2 weeks straight. Meanwhile, Karen's lawyer escalated. I got a notice that they were seeking a temporary restraining order to halt the dissolution until a court hearing. It was a gutsy move. If the judge granted it, the HOA would essentially be on life support until the case was decided. But it also meant they had to present actual legal arguments instead of just posturing. At the hearing, the courtroom was half full of curious neighbors, most of whom had never set foot in a courthouse before. Karen sat at the plaintiff's table in a tailored blazer, her expression carefully arranged into one of grave concern. Her lawyer did most of the talking, arguing that the vote was sprung upon the membership without adequate notice, and that I had manipulated the process to achieve a predetermined outcome. When it was my turn, I simply walked the judge through the notice timeline, the attendance records, and the fact that the dissolution clause had been part of the bylaws for over a decade. I even had copies of old meeting minutes showing Karen herself had once used the same notice period for a major policy change. The judge denied the restraining order. Politely but firmly. Karen's lawyer tried to request an expedited trial date, but the judge wasn't having it. "This appears to be a matter for civil resolution between members," he said, which was judicial speak for, "stop wasting my time." That ruling was a turning point. People who had been on the fence now saw that Karen wasn't some invincible authority figure. She was just a neighbor with a bad habit of overstepping. Support for her dwindled further. But she still had one last card to play, and it was the kind of move only someone truly desperate would attempt. About a week later, the neighborhood woke up to find laminated signs posted on every mailbox. Each one read, "Notice. Effective immediately, Willow Ridge will be re-establishing HOA membership and dues for all residents." Beneath that was a payment deadline and a threat of legal action for non-compliance. The signs weren't signed by any official entity, just the board. It was pure bluff, and it reeked of panic. I pulled one of the signs down and emailed a photo to the entire neighborhood, pointing out that the board no longer existed and that any attempt to collect dues was not just unenforceable, but potentially fraudulent. That afternoon, 2 residents called the police. Not because they thought they were in legal trouble, but because they suspected Karen of trespassing to post the signs. Officers came, listened, and left without taking action, but the point was made. Karen's credibility was in free fall. Then came the moment I'd been waiting for. One of the HOA's former treasurers, a quiet woman named Linda, who had resigned years ago over creative bookkeeping, showed up at my door with a manila envelope. Inside were copies of invoices, emails, and receipts, proof that Karen had been funneling HOA funds toward personal expenses. Nothing huge individually, but enough to show a pattern. Catering for private parties billed as community events, landscaping work done exclusively on her property, and gift cards purchased under the guise of volunteer appreciation that never made it to the volunteers. I decided not to wait for Karen's next move to blindside me. If she was talking to the county's zoning and planning department, it meant she was trying to use another arm of bureaucracy to claw back some authority over the neighborhood. Karen wasn't the type to admit defeat. She was the type to switch battlefields. That was fine by me. I'd fight her on whichever one she chose, but this time, I wanted to meet her on the field before she planted her flag. The next morning, I drove down to the county offices myself. I knew the staff there casually from past professional dealings, so I started with some small talk before getting to the point. "I heard there's been some discussion about zoning adjustments for Willow Ridge," I said. The clerk gave me the kind of cautious smile that said they knew something but weren't sure how much they should say. Eventually, they admitted that a concerned resident had inquired about reclassifying certain parcels, including mine, into a special overlay district that would maintain aesthetic continuity. That was HOA speak in county clothing. If she pulled it off, the overlay would enforce property restrictions similar to HOA rules, but through municipal code instead. And since it would be a county ordinance, there'd be no board to dissolve. I had to admit, this was a smart play. For anyone else, it might have been checkmate. For me, it was just another puzzle. I asked the clerk for copies of any petitions, filings, or correspondence related to the proposed overlay. It turned out nothing formal had been filed yet. Karen was still in the feeling out phase, probably trying to figure out if she could get enough neighbor support before going public. That gave me a window, and I planned to slam it shut before she could get her fingers through. That evening, I invited my closest allies, Chris, Linda, and Paul, over for a strategy session. We sat around my kitchen table with mugs of coffee and a pile of notepads. She's going to try to backdoor the HOA through county code, I explained. If she gets this overlay district, we're right back where we started, except this time, it'll be harder to undo. Chris swore under his breath. Linda just shook her head. She never stops, she muttered. Our first step was to make sure the neighborhood knew what was coming. I drafted a one-page fact sheet explaining what an overlay district was, how it worked, and why it would essentially be an HOA in disguise. I included examples from other counties where similar overlays had led to absurd restrictions, like banning certain front door colors or mandating a specific type of mulch. The examples were true, documented cases. Facts were my best weapon. The next day, we hand-delivered the fact sheets to every house in Willow Ridge. We didn't just drop them in mailboxes. We knocked on doors and had conversations. Most people were shocked. A few admitted they'd heard Karen talking about bringing back order, but hadn't realized she meant through county law. By the end of the week, I had commitments from over 30 residents to oppose any such measure. That was more than enough to kill it if it ever came up for a vote. But Karen wasn't sitting still either. 2 days later, I learned she had been meeting individually with some of the more image-conscious homeowners, showing them glossy mock-ups of what a consistent, regulated neighborhood would look like. She was selling it as a way to keep undesirable elements out, code words everyone recognized but nobody wanted to say out loud. Her tactic was ugly but effective. Fear of change is a powerful motivator. I decided to undercut her pitch with something she couldn't counter: hard data. Using publicly available real estate records, I put together a chart showing property value trends for Willow Ridge compared to 2 nearby neighborhoods. One with an HOA, one without. The result was undeniable. Our property values had risen steadily, just like the HOA neighborhoods, and faster than the unregulated one. In other words, Karen's property value argument was nonsense. I printed the chart in full color and included it in a second round of neighborhood mailers. That move got under her skin. I knew because the very next morning, she marched up my driveway uninvited. No smile this time. "You're undermining a community initiative," she said flatly. "Do you even care what happens here in 10 years? I stayed leaning against my fence, coffee in hand. "I care enough to keep the government from telling me what kind of flowers I can plant," I said. "I also care enough to keep my neighbors from being manipulated." Her eyes narrowed. "You're twisting things." I shrugged. "I'm just reading the numbers." She left without another word, but later that afternoon, Chris texted me a photo of her in a cafe with 2 county commissioners. She was still trying to rally support at a higher level, probably hoping the county would see it as a revenue or control opportunity. I wasn't about to let her dominate that narrative, so I scheduled my own meeting with the same commissioners. When I walked into their offices, I brought 3 things: the chart showing property value stability, a petition signed by over 30 residents opposing the overlay, and a binder of legal opinions explaining how such a district could trigger lawsuits over property rights. I kept the tone professional, emphasizing that this wasn't about Karen personally, but about the unnecessary burden it would place on both residents and county resources. By the time I left, both commissioners were nodding along. It wasn't enough to completely kill the idea. It was still in the exploratory phase, but it made sure they knew the political cost of supporting it. And politicians, more than anyone, hate political cost. The real turning point came a week later, when the county planning department held a public vision meeting for residents to share their thoughts on future zoning. Karen showed up with a stack of prepared remarks and a few of her loyalists. She spoke passionately about preserving neighborhood character and maintaining visual harmony. She painted a picture of a tidy, uniform community where every yard was manicured and no one had to see unsightly elements. When it was my turn, I didn't go after her directly. Instead, I told the story of my neighbor Margaret, the elderly widow Karen had fined for her January wreath, and explained how rules that sound harmless on paper often end up punishing good people for things that don't matter. Then I walked the room through the data showing our values had held strong without additional restrictions. I wrapped up by reminding everyone that order was only valuable if it didn't come at the cost of our freedom to live in our own homes. The applause was louder than I expected. Not thunderous, but enough to make the commissioners glance at each other. When the meeting ended, one of them pulled me aside to quietly say, "I don't think this overlay is going anywhere." That was as close to a victory declaration as I could have hoped for. Karen, of course, didn't speak to me afterward. She gathered her papers, muttered something to her supporters, and left quickly. But I caught a flicker in her expression, not anger this time, but calculation. She wasn't giving up, she was recalibrating. The Voluntary Beautification Club started quietly enough. Karen handed out glossy brochures with photos of perfectly trimmed hedges and pristine driveways, along with a list of benefits, like group discounts on landscaping services and seasonal decorating contests. The buy-in was a modest $50 a year, and the rules were framed as guidelines rather than requirements. It was the most diplomatic I had ever seen her. But I'd been watching her long enough to know this was just her trying a softer approach after the HOA disaster and zoning failure. Karen didn't care about flowers or group rates, she cared about control. And she was hoping people wouldn't notice the difference until it was too late. For the first few weeks, I stayed in the background. I didn't campaign against it, didn't warn anyone, didn't so much as raise an eyebrow when I saw her going door to door with her clipboard. My goal was to see who she could actually convince without interference. If she managed to rope in the same dozen loyalists who had voted against dissolution, fine, she'd have a harmless book club with lawnmowers. But if she started pulling in the people I'd fought hard to get on my side, I'd step in. By the end of the first month, I got my answer. Karen had signed up 14 households, still less than half the neighborhood, but more than I expected. And to my disappointment, a few were people I'd considered allies during the HOA fight. When I called Chris to ask what happened, he sighed. She pitched it as totally voluntary, no fines, no enforcement. Honestly, I thought it might help with the leaf problem in the fall. That was how she'd get them. Low stakes, low cost, no apparent downside. Then she'd start ratcheting up the expectations until they were halfway back in an HOA without realizing it. I wasn't going to let that happen. The first thing I did was request a copy of the club bylaws, which Karen had proudly posted online. I read them carefully and found exactly what I was looking for. A clause stating that members could vote to change the rules at any time, with only a simple majority needed. That meant that once she had enough members, she could push through mandatory compliance on landscaping, paint colors, and whatever else she decided beautified the neighborhood. It also meant that if I joined, I'd have a say in those votes. So I joined. $50 bought me a front row seat to her new experiment, and I made sure she handed me a receipt with her signature on it. At the next club meeting, in her living room, I sat quietly as she laid out plans for the summer, group planting days, shared tool rentals, and a photo contest for Most Improved Yard. People were nodding along, chatting about color palettes and mulch type. Karen looked relaxed, confident. Halfway through the meeting, I raised my hand. "Quick question, I said casually. Since we can change the rules with a simple majority, are we going to vote on everything as a group? Or is the leadership going to set some of the guidelines on their own? She hesitated for just a second too long before saying, "Oh well, for efficiency's sake, the leadership can make small adjustments, but anything major will be voted on." It was the perfect non-answer, vague enough to leave the door wide open for whatever she wanted to do later. I smiled and let it drop. For now. Over the next 2 months, I played the role of a model member. I showed up to planting days, helped unload mulch, and even donated a few potted plants for the communal flower bed. I chatted with other members and made sure they liked me. The friendlier I seemed, the more likely they'd listen when I eventually pointed out what Karen was trying to pull. The turning point came in July. Karen sent out an email announcing a proposed seasonal standards initiative. On the surface, it sounded innocent, a set of recommended seasonal maintenance tasks to keep the neighborhood looking its best. But buried in the fine print was a clause stating that these recommendations would be considered membership obligations starting the following year. Anyone who didn't meet them could lose access to the club's group discounts and events. It wasn't a fine, but it was punishment, and it was the first step toward real enforcement. The vote was scheduled for the next meeting. I spent the week before it having quiet conversations with as many members as I could. I pointed out how voluntary organizations lose their charm the second they start issuing obligations. I reminded them how quickly things had escalated with the HOA and how this was the same pattern. Small, friendly rules that slowly became hard rules. Some people shrugged it off, but others started to frown. When the meeting rolled around, Karen gave a glowing speech about community pride and raising the bar together. Then she opened the floor for discussion. I kept my voice calm, my tone friendly. "I love the idea of seasonal tasks," I said. "But making them obligations changes the whole nature of this club. If we vote for this, we're basically creating a mini HOA. And I think most of us joined because we didn't want that." There was a murmur in the room. A few people nodded. Karen's smile tightened. "This is nothing like an HOA," she said quickly. "We're just setting standards for ourselves." I spread my hand. "Exactly. Standards for ourselves. Which means each person decides for themselves. The second we make them obligations, we stop being voluntary. And if people want obligations, there's an HOA down the road happy to have them." It worked. When the votes were counted, the proposal failed, by 1 vote. Karen's eyes flicked to me, and I knew she had figured out exactly who had cost her the win. The rest of the summer was quieter. Karen still ran the club, but her momentum was gone. Members started skipping events, claiming they were too busy. A few even dropped out entirely. Without the ability to enforce rules, the club was just another neighborhood group, and without that creeping authority, it didn't hold her interest for long. By September, she had stopped sending out newsletters, and the last official event was a poorly attended fall cleanup where most of the work was done by 3 teenagers Karen had roped in for community service hours. By winter, the club was effectively dead. And with it, Karen's third attempt at control had fizzled out. The neighborhood had settled into a new normal, one without fines, without bylaws, without endless debates over mailbox paint. People kept their yards in decent shape because they wanted to, not because someone was threatening them. It was almost peaceful. I didn't see much of Karen after that. She still lived 2 streets over, but our paths rarely crossed. When they did, she'd give me a curt nod and keep walking. There was no more pretense of neighborly warmth, no more speeches about community standards. She had learned, at least for now, that I wasn't someone she could outmaneuver. And yet, I stayed ready. Not because I expected her to try again, though I wouldn't put it past her, but because there's always another Karen somewhere. Someone who thinks rules are only good when they're the ones writing them. Someone who confuses control with community.